Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of political science and civics. I am your host, Paul Rader. Today, we're going to be talking about how it's election polling season, and here's what you should know about it. We have a midterm election this year, and that means you're going to see a whole bunch of polls for a whole bunch of races. Polls make for easy fodder for political media of all sorts of political stripes, hardcore voters, and even somewhat engaged voters to gobble up and discuss ad nauseum. But then some polls turn out to be off the mark, and then people start complaining about them being fake and bad and yada, 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 and then the cycle repeats for every election. Now, it is true that polls have faced a lot of obstacles in recent years, and some polls are just bad, and they're becoming harder to do. But they are still a valuable source of info on public opinion, if you know how to use them correctly. They should not be treated as the end-all be-all, but they also shouldn't be tossed to the side. And you certainly shouldn't treat them as gospel and then flip-flop and say, oh, they're trash after they turn out to be wrong. So, as we approach the 2026 election, and for subsequent elections, what are the biggest misconceptions about polls or surveys? What are the most important things to know about polls so that you can be equipped in how to best interpret and discuss them? And which ones should you care about? Well, that's what today's episode is about. Here we go. Let's first of all clear up some misunderstandings about polling. And there's a lot of them. And a lot of them are pervasive. And oftentimes these criticisms of polls are overblown, and sometimes that's for political gain. And sometimes it's just a simple misunderstanding about what polls actually do. Now, commentators might say polls suck so that they can gain clout in some way, even though they'll trip over themselves to still report on another poll whenever it's convenient for them or it says something that's in some way interesting to them. And then some politicians will just dismiss polls that say they aren't winning and say that they're fake, they're rigged, that they're dumb, they don't measure true American support or some sort of nonsense, because for some reason they think, some of these politicians think that they can't possibly be losing at something. Or they don't heed warnings in these polls that say, hey, look, you might want to think about X issue here so that people start actually supporting you. But, politicians want to hear only what they want to hear, and candidates only want to hear what they want to hear a lot of times. And then other people simply just don't understand or like polls, or they think that they negatively impact election outcomes significantly by swaying people's opinions. Now, polls can influence people's decisions a little bit. Some people really do believe in I want to vote for a winner, but that's really not that common. It doesn't really have that much influence on what people do in elections or whether they come out. For a few people, it'll have that impact. And in a really close race, it could potentially make a little bit of a difference, but by and large, it's not really going to make any sort of this election was won because this poll came out. No, that's not going to happen. Another misconception about polls is that people think that polls are lying just because they turn out to be incorrect. That there's just something inherently fundamentally flawed in these polls, if not outright fabricating what people are thinking. There are polls that are fake, but they are few and far between, and they are purposely there to skew people's opinions about something, and sometimes it's just a pure troll job. Like back in the 2016 election cycle, there was a fake poll that was being circulated that said that if the election was held on whatever day it was, that Kid Rock would beat Democratic U.S. Senator Debbie Stabenow in a race for her seat, for her to win that seat again. And of course, this was well before Kid Rock headlined an alternate Super Bowl halftime show, but this was not a poll that actually existed. The so-called company that administered it, that didn't exist. And problem is the media kept circulating it just because it looked so, oh, wow, this was crazy. Can you believe this? People want Kid Rock over Debbie Stabenow? That wasn't a thing. Kid Rock didn't say he was going to run for election. That is part of the problem, is that media, including media that wants to deride polls when they turn out to be wrong, this media often treats all polls as worthwhile for discussion because it's a very easy way to get clicks and views. People see, oh, who's winning this race? They have to know who's winning right now, when it's not really a thing. Like, this person is winning at this point in time. I mean, or at least their concept of who's winning right now is not really quite winning. But, there is this whole obsession with winning that people have, whether it's they want their candidate to win or they're just simply interested in, well, which of these candidates in this race is in the lead for this office. People just have this need to know, and it happens to everybody. To some extent, we all have an interest in, oh, who's winning such and such. But problem is, a lot of times media will just circulate polls without even thinking about whether they're actually whether they're real polls, and B, whether they're real polls, but they're actually good and worthwhile. Not every poll is worthwhile. That is true. It's just when you make a blanket statement about all polls being crap is the problem. So even crappy polls and mediocre pollsters still can get publicity if what they report seems interesting enough. And so that can really cloud people's perceptions about the reliability of polls. And so you can just get hoodwinked by fake polls because of this lack of vetting. And also just the need for media to be first, because in their minds, they're winning at the media game. And then also media consumers want everything now. And so they want to hear about things right away before things can necessarily be vetted. But polls are not lying to you. At least the good ones are not lying to you. We can't know with 100% certainty what the entire public is thinking. That's why we're polling them. If we could figure out what the entire public was thinking, we wouldn't need polls. So we can't know with full certainty this is what the entire public is thinking. So there's going to be inherently a little bit of uncertainty there. And we don't know the relatively few people that are going to change their mind, even though a lot of people eventually or have made up their minds well in advance, but there are going to be a few people that change their minds. And you don't know which people are going to show up to vote. So polls can be a bit off in that regard. And you don't know which people are going to show up necessarily. A lot of people you do know who are going to show up based on their voting history. And we'll talk about that in a little bit here. But sometimes people who seem like they're going to vote right now don't actually turn out to vote. And some people you won't necessarily know who that is. And also, another big issue with polls is that there's these non-response biases that we encounter. Non-response bias being when a pollster calls a home that they randomly sampled, they could not get somebody on the phone, or they did get somebody on the phone, but they just did not want to answer a survey. So then they have to go sample somebody else. And early on in public research, this was not much of a problem. People were much more willing to pick up the phone and answer these polls. Now, as landline phones have disappeared and spam calls have dramatically risen and general distrust of polling and anything politically related has increased, it's become harder to get people to answer these surveys. And the reason why it's such a problem for these surveys is because when you're randomly sampling and somebody decides, I'm not answering this poll, they're still part of that population you're trying to figure out the opinions of, but they've taken themselves out of it. So you can't really gauge what they're thinking. You're only able to sample people who are willing to answer the poll. So that can really skew the results, and more on that in a little bit. So legitimate polls are doing the best they can with the information and respondents that are available. Another misconception about polls: they are not supposed to be exact measures of what the public feels. They are estimates. People do not distinguish between what a sample is and a population. A sample is a segment of the population that you are polling, that you are surveying, that you are figuring out information about, so that you can hopefully extrapolate across the whole population, because the population is ultimately what matters in the end. They're the ones who are actually voting on the whole thing. It's not just your sample. So polls are the sample, election results are population-based because it's the whole population. But the reason we do samples is, again, because it's impossible to get the entire population's feelings on something. If we could get the whole population, we wouldn't need polls. So we have to do the best we can with what we got. And so sampling is what we need to do. And they're also supposed to be a snapshot in time, not necessarily a prediction. It's not trying to say like, oh, candidate A got 43% of the vote and candidate B got 41% of the votes. And so that means we're predicting that candidate A is getting 43% of the vote in the election. No, that's not what it means. It's just at this point in time, this is the estimate of what people feel right now. And ideally, you want multiple snapshots in time so that you can measure a trend and therefore come up with an even more accurate estimation of what the public thinks. And another big misconception about polling, something that people misunderstand, and it is one of the biggest misconceptions, and we actually talked a little bit about it with my guest Alex Patton from a few episodes ago, because he has been ingrained in the polling business for quite some time. What margin of error actually means. When news segments talk about margin of error or any sort of commentary talks about margin of error, it's usually brought up with little, if any, actual explanation of what it is. So the very simple version, so we don't get bogged down in the very technical stuff. Margins of error are based on confidence intervals that are calculated based on how large the sample is. The larger the sample, the smaller the margin of error, because you came closer to matching the population's opinion, you got more of the population, and so you are more confident in what the sample says. But because a sample inherently has some uncertainty as to how much it reflects the population, there is still going to be a margin of error as to what the actual public opinion is. So the margin of error basically says you have a lot of confidence that the public opinion on X candidate or X issue is between X% and Y%. However, because we cannot be 100% confident on what the population thinks, we can't ask the whole population, there is still a very slight chance that the real population's opinion falls just outside that margin of error. It's a very slight chance, but it's still possible. So let's take candidates A and B again. So candidate A has 48% of the sample's vote, and candidate B has 43% of the sample's vote. And the margin of error is 5 points, plus or minus. It's always plus or minus because it's a range. So candidate A has 48% of the vote. If it's plus or minus, that means we're very confident that the true support for candidate A is between 43 and 53%, because 48 minus 5 is 43, 48 plus 5 is 53. But there is still a very slight chance that candidate A's public support actually falls outside of that range. So there might be a chance that candidate A's support is actually 54% or 55%, or on the flip side, maybe 42% or 41%. Statistically, it's very unlikely that that's the case, but there is still a little bit of a chance. So now you might ask, if we can't be 100% confident, why even bother measuring public opinion? Why would we do anything if we don't know for certain how things are? We need to be a little bit more uncomfortable with uncertainty when it comes to politics. And it's not a comfortable thing for anybody to have. We naturally want things to be clear to us, like this is how things are. So a lot of times we get frustrated with nuance in politics, especially when we debate issues and candidates. But even in polling, there's a little bit of nuance here. But the reason why we do public opinion research, why we do polls and surveys, even though we can't be 100% confident, is because it's the best method we have for gauging the wider public's opinion on something. Despite all the issues that the industry of polling has faced, there's not really another method we have to get a wide-scale approach to what people's opinion is, or what the whole population's opinion is. whether that population is a whole state, like you're measuring for a governor's race, or if it's for president, you're measuring the whole country, or if it's a county commission race, you're measuring for the county. But campaigns also need this information to tailor their campaign messages. They don't just tailor their message just on a whim of what they think. Well, probably some candidates do, but they pretty much never win. But campaigns want this public opinion information so they can see, oh, wait a minute, people really care about this issue. I need to speak on this issue to shore up support. And then civic-minded individuals who are not trying to win a race, but they're just trying to address issues that the public cares about, they want to use this information too to say, oh, okay, this is what this part of the community really cares about. Let's talk about this. Maybe they're just trying to bring people together to try to solve an issue, or maybe they're an interest group that has some sort of stake in the matter and they want to know what people's opinion about it is. So polls have great use for a lot of people. Unfortunately, a lot of people poo-poo them and think that they're useless. They're not useless. It's just, again, it's a matter of knowing how to use them and how to interpret them. Because the interpretation of polls is what's really the problem. Another misconception about public opinion polling is, and this maybe is not necessarily that widespread, but some people do kind of make this assumption, not every pollster does their polls the same way. A lot of people just assume that it's all done the exact same way, and it's not. Though every worthwhile pollster does do random sampling, because that's how you statistically get something as close to the population as you can, the exact methods and calculation and such may be proprietary. They might have their own special little formula that is super top secret and nobody else outside the organization can know, and that's how they come up with their sampling and their weighting and stuff. And we'll talk more about what that is in a minute. But also, one last misconception about polls. When we talk about dead heats, they're not really actually a thing. They're often not really dead heats. People look at a poll and say, oh, well, this candidate has 45% of support, and then this candidate has 45% of the vote. They're tied. No, again, margin of error. Their support is somewhere likely within a certain range, but their support for both of them is almost certainly not exactly 45%. It's a gauge. It's an estimate. There's an inherent uncertainty of sampling. Can't stress that enough. That makes these so-called statistical ties unlikely to be really ties. We just don't fully know which way the lean is. And the lean might be ever so slight, but it's there. We just don't know what it is right now, because we don't know with 100% certainty where the population's public opinion is. And so also, when you look at election ratings, don't mistake toss-ups in election ratings as dead heats either. It's just basically saying that, look, this race is too close to make a strong assertion that this person is in the lead. And of course, those election ratings use polling as part of their calculations. Now, how much they use the polling as part of their calculations will differ based on whether you're talking about inside elections or Cook Political Report or any other election rating system, Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball, Elections Daily. So C-Analysis. The polls are going to be part of those election ratings, but the toss-ups don't mean like they're actually legitimately tied. It's just that it's really too close to call, which I guess for some people basically means tied, but dead heat's not really an accurate term whenever you see two candidates being neck and neck. Now, those are misconceptions about polling. Let's talk about what polls actually matter, because indicated earlier on that, yes, some polls suck and some polls are flat out fake, but there are still good polls and there are sometimes great polls. But not every poll is worthwhile. And some may be interesting, but their ability to tell us what could happen is limited, or they don't actually tell us what we think they're telling us. Now, you can look at, there are a bunch of respected pollsters who have a good body of work, even though sometimes people who are uninformed will still lambaste them, or people who just have a major misconception about how polling works, they might still get lambasted. just because they might have one high-profile miss. Some polling-oriented pundits, like Nate Silver, formerly of 538, he's somebody who ranks pollsters based on a variety of measures. You can find other people that do that same kind of thing, or just like a general, like, hey, who's a respected pollster? And you'll usually find a pretty good list. Now, obviously, you got to be careful because some people will still highlight the pollsters that they conveniently like, but usually when you look at people who are in the industry, there's usually like a consensus of, okay, these pollsters are generally pretty good. Some colleges and universities have departments that are dedicated to polling, and those are usually pretty good. Even a couple news organizations with noticeable partisan or ideological biases, like the New York Times for the left or Fox News for the right, they also generally have pretty good polling too. It doesn't really behoove them to have a bad poll. Now, which polls that these organizations like Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, Newsmax, One American News, whatever ones that they actually highlight on their reporting segments, those you might want to take a little bit with a grain of salt because they're generally going to highlight polls that are benefiting their side of the aisle, but they're not necessarily showcasing bad polls. So you might have a good poll, but because it conveniently says what that organization wants it to say, they might highlight that. And campaigns do that too, which we'll bring up in just a minute. Now, there are some kinds of polls, as in types of polls, that you should be a little wary of as well for various reasons. And a couple of them to highlight here. One type of poll to take with a grain of salt is what we call the generic congressional ballot. What a generic congressional ballot does is it measures what party respondents would vote for without naming any candidates for congressional seats. So if you're going to vote for a U.S. House rep and you don't bring up a specific name, would you vote for the Republican or the Democrat? And they say Republican or Democrat, or they say neither, they say independent, whatever. That's a generic congressional ballot. Those are good for gauging general sentiment toward the parties, but it doesn't really necessarily translate to how the seats for Congress will split. So if right now, because it's a midterm and a Republican president, in this case Donald Trump, is in office, typically the party that is not the president's party does worse in midterms. So Democrats are generally looking better right now for 2026, and that might be different in 2030. But for 2026, Democrats are generally doing better on generic congressional balloting. So if you have one that says the generic Democrat would win 54% of the time to 46% of the time for Republicans, that doesn't necessarily mean that 54% of U.S. House seats will go to the Democrats and then 46% will go to the Republicans. It depends on where those votes come from. So even though you're randomly sampling, you may have just happened to pull from a bunch of districts or a bunch of communities that tend to lean much more Democratic, or you just happen to get a few more Democrats in your sample than you did Republicans. So that can skew things a little bit and not necessarily bias your sample, but it won't give you as accurate of a picture. That doesn't necessarily mean that it is that Democrats aren't actually going to win either. They might actually win more seats than 54%. They might win like 58% of seats, but because people can only vote on their specific district's congressional seat, a generic congressional ballot's not necessarily going to translate into how many of the seats that party is going to win in Congress. Because again, there is still the factor of, well, what if you take specific Republicans and Democrats, and that will inherently skew things a little bit. Now, generally speaking, most people are going to vote for a candidate based on whether they're a Republican or a Democrat, but still, there will be a little bit of difference compared to a generic congressional ballot. And you also have to account for the fact that the vast majority of incumbents win their reelection, although a lot of Republicans are not running for reelection this year. Just FYI about generic congressional ballots, be cognizant of those, be a little wary of those. But beyond that, one that you really have to watch out for is these online polls, because these are not randomly sampled. So whenever you're on the internet and you're just browsing, social media or going on whatever website, and you see an ad that says so and so wants you to take this quiz, and or this survey, and it's conveniently toward one party. It's not always going to be like that. Sometimes it is not a specific party or aligned with a party, and they want to know what you're thinking. It's still going to be biased because it's not randomly sampled, because people who feel strongly enough are going to click on that ad. Whereas even though a lot of people aren't answering the phone on a survey, more and more people are not answering phone surveys. Sometimes when they get on the phone, they'll still be like, okay, fine, I'll take a survey. But on the internet, you're probably not going to click on, or you're probably not going to click on it if unless it's something that you really feel strongly about. So you're going to skew the sample towards people who feel strong enough about what's going on right now. And it's also biased towards people who have internet, or at least good internet. Now, yes, most people have internet these days, but there are still a lot of people, like out in a lot of rural areas, who have little, if any, access to broadband, even in the year 2026. They're inherently going to be out of the side of the range of the sample because they don't have internet, so they can't take an online poll. And if it's an ad for a poll, that ad is probably already biased by an algorithm showing that ad for certain people. And who knows what that algorithm is necessarily taking into account. So you might be getting only a certain segment of the population that would ever be reached by that online poll. Whereas in a random survey through phones, almost pretty much everybody has a phone. But even, of course, now fewer people have landlines, so there's still a certain bias to that, but it's not the same kind of bias as you have with an online poll. Online polls arguably have a worse sampling bias just because they're self-selection as opposed to random sampling. Now, let's put aside whether a poll actually matters or not. Let's just assume we're talking about good polls now. What are the most important parts of a poll that you should know? Because a big problem for discussions about polling is that it's either boring or too complicated for most people to listen to. Even if they could actually understand it, they just don't. They just hear numbers, lots of memes about how much math sucks, and they just say, I'm not dealing with that. Just tell me who's winning, because people want to know who's winning. Again, there's a little part in all of us that wants to know who's winning at something. It's a very human thing to do. You just have to be aware of it. But the media provides that fodder because the media also wants to know who's winning. And so they tell us who is supposedly winning in an election, even if it's not really a full picture, and usually is not. But most people will consider the very nitty-gritty details of polls boring or too complicated. And in fairness, a lot of it can be complicated, partly because we overcomplicate things when we're talking about polling and its intricacies. But that being said, here are some of the important things for you to know about, so that if you do decide you want to dig into polling a little bit more, here are some of the biggest things you want to look out for so that you can assess whether it's a worthwhile poll or how much stock you should put in a poll. So one of the biggest things to think about is who is behind the poll. So some pollsters, like colleges and universities that I mentioned earlier, don't have specific candidates that they want to win. So they're usually they're not necessarily biased as to who they want to win. So you can say, oh, okay, this is just what they came up with. However, many pollsters that are private typically align with either the Republican or Democratic parties and will typically only work with Republican candidates or only with Democratic candidates. And so they have an incentive to promote polls that prop up their candidate. Now, that does not mean that the polls themselves are a lie, because it is in that pollster's best interest to make a good poll for their internal strategy, because if they don't have a good poll, they can't make a good strategy, and that might lose them an election. And then so they won't get hired again. So they want to make a good poll, but they do have an incentive to keep polls that make the candidate seem weak under wraps. And to refer back to my guest from a few weeks ago, Alex Patton, said a lot of the juiciest polls are ones that don't actually get released by these organizations. They don't release these polls because it's going to make their candidate look bad, or it's going to make these pollsters look bad. And again, we talk about these candidates not liking when a poll makes them look bad. And so a lot of times these pollsters will keep those polls under wraps. Now, they might talk to the candidate about the poll and say, hey, look, this X, Y, and Z things are a problem for you. But again, they're not going to put it out in public. But again, does not mean you shouldn't actually listen to those polls. You just have to understand that they're only showing you curated side of the story that they want you to see. So there's a big difference there. Other things to look out for in polls, and I'm going to group these three things together: margin of error, sample sizes, and random sampling. Mentioned all three of those things earlier, but to go a little bit more into them, any poll that is worth looking into will tell you these things pretty easily. They will flat out say in a sentence or two, sample size was this was randomly sampled, margin of error is this. Okay, good. If they're going out of their way to hide these things from you and it's too hard to find these statistics, then you might want to take a step back and think about whether you actually want to see this poll, because they should make those things pretty obvious for you to see. Now, the margin of error, once again, is going to be based on the sample or the size of the sample, excuse me. Larger the sample, the more accurate the poll will be, and so the smaller the margin of error will be. But if you don't randomly sample, you're going to bias the results because you're cherry picking people for the survey. Randomness is much more likely to come to the population's views as opposed to, if you know what, I like this one and I'm going to pick this one. No, you want to randomly select them. And the ways that people do that is they usually have like a random number generator that will go. A computer will put all of these phone numbers in and select it at random as opposed to people manually picking the phone number. Another thing to look out for in polls is the representativeness of the sample and the weighting. It's not just about being randomly sampled. You also want it to reflect the population. Now, random sampling might, because it's random, you might not get quite representative of the representative sample, or a sample that is representative of the population. So if I have a population, if I'm looking at a state that has 35% Democrats, 40% Republican, and then 25% that is independent or third party, but my sample actually is like 35% Republican and 40% Democrat. I've oversampled Democrats and I've undersampled Republicans. Not intentionally, it's just how it happened. So ideally, you want your sample as demographically close to population you are gauging or trying to gauge as possible, by party ID, by race, by gender, by age, income, if you can, although you don't necessarily have that information as easily as these other things. And the reason why you want it to be demographically representative is that demographics tend to have a certain lean. Some lean more Democrat, some lean more Republican. Younger voters, even though a lot of them are independents, they still tend to be a bit more Democratic versus older voters that tend to be a bit more Republican. That's just one example. And so if the representativeness of the sample is off, pollsters will tend to make up for it through a process called weighting for specific demographic groups. Weighting as in like the weight of somebody. So you will weight a sample if you underrepresent a group or if you overrepresent a group. If you underrepresent a group, it's because the percentage of your sample for that demographic group is smaller than the percentage for the population. So if the population had 20% black voters and my sample only had 15% black voters, that's an underrepresentation. And so you might put more weight on that group to make up for that difference, saying, well, I had fewer black voters in this sample compared to the population, so I'm actually going to beef up that opinion a little bit, not because of any biases, but because you're trying to make it more representative of the overall population. And Black voters overwhelmingly vote Democratic. So the fact that you had fewer Black voters could skew the results in favor of the Republican candidate, for example. Not necessarily the case, and you might have a district where the Black voters tend to vote more Republican than other districts, but you still want it to be as representative as possible because you're trying to gauge the overall population of a district or a state or the country as much as you possibly can. But again, you can't gauge the entire population, so you have to have a sample. But then if you overrepresent a group, that means you put less weight on them. So if I had a population where 65 and older voters were 45% of the population, but my sample took 50% was 50% 65 years or older, then I might put less weight on them because I have pulled more elderly voters than I intended to, or that more elderly voters as a percentage of the sample compared to the population. Speaking of which, the opinions of certain demographic subsets of the population is something that you want to account for as well, because of that tendency for certain demographics to vote a certain way. Now, this requires more thorough digging and coverage on these polls, so it's not often talked about, but it is something that you want to look out for. So we'll use Black voters again. Generally speaking, just as a rule of thumb, Black voters tend to be about 88-90% Democratic, or put a different way, about 10 to 12% Republican. But if you find in your poll that there's 15 to 20% of Black voters that are going to vote Republican, that should raise alarm bells if you're a Democrat, because that means you are losing, even though you have an overwhelming majority of that demographic, because you are not winning as many of them as you expect to. That could actually lose you the election. That could make all the difference in whether you win this race that you're talking about, because you're not winning as much of this demographic's vote as you should be, theoretically. So if one demographic feels more strongly or weakly about a candidate or issue than you would expect, that is very noteworthy, and that means campaigns need to tailor their messages accordingly. So if they're trying to shore up votes amongst young voters or Black voters or church-going voters or whatever it is that they're trying to shore up votes and really trying to stabilize, that poll might give them that information they need to say, oh, okay, I really need to reach out more to this demographic. And one last thing about polls to look out for, and I'm going to consider it its own section. It's the timing of polls and why the timing of polls matters. Because if a poll is many months in advance of an election, there is a lot of time for a lot of different things to happen. If you see a lot of enthusiasm for voting 9 months out, for example, is that going to keep up until election day? It's going to be very hard for a lot of people to sustain it. Now, some people who are very hardcore voters, they're going to be able to sustain that enthusiasm or that anger or whatever it is, but you're already expecting them to go vote anyways. You're looking more at people who are not as regular voters. They might be fairly regular, or they might be very irregular voters. And right now they're telling you, oh yeah, I'm going to go vote. They might be saying that right now, but are they necessarily going to be doing that 9 months from now, 8 months from now, 7? Are they even going to do it 2 weeks from now? It's very easy for people to say that they're going to do it, but ultimately then they don't do it. Or they might overemphasize their enthusiasm because they think that they should come across as more enthusiastic to vote. Now, I'm not saying a lot of people do that, but there is a little bit of that social desirability bias. So that is one aspect of how the timing of polls can matter. Also, when something big in politics happens, there tends to be a short-term fluctuation and then things steady back out. So if you see like a debate and, we talk about who won a debate, and when the consensus is, let's just say, candidate A won a debate versus candidate B, there might be a short-term boost to the support of candidate A after that debate. But then after a week or two, it'll level out and maybe candidate A says something stupid later on. Now, it is true that a lot of voters have already decided well in advance of a general election who they will vote for because of the party ID. All else equal, most Democrats are going to vote Democrat. Most Republicans are going to vote Republican. And a lot of independents who lean toward one party or the other are going to ultimately vote for that party. However, you will still have a few people that will sort out who to vote for nearer to the election or closer to election time, or if they even vote at all. You might have somebody who says, oh yeah, I'm totally going to vote for the Republican. Oh yeah, I'm going to totally vote for the Democrat. But they don't actually even go out to vote. And if they were going to go out to vote, they would have done what they said they were going to do. But that doesn't really matter if you don't actually go out to vote now, does it? So that's another way that the timing of polls matters. Or also, there could be a major scandal in the lead up to an election that completely changes public opinion. Now, some people are probably going to hear that and say, well, based on recent events, people can say what or do whatever they want and they won't get punished. That is not true. There's very few people that can make it through scandals. Now, however culpable they are, I'm not talking about that. But there are a few people that can make it through scandals. But by and large, scandals will tank somebody's prospects, or at least members of their party might call on them to exit the race so that it doesn't rub off on everybody else. So like if we have a Republican that has a major scandal going on, the rest of the Republican Party might distance themselves and say, hey, you need to get out of there. It's the same thing for a Democrat, just so it doesn't reflect on the rest of the party. And also, early enough in an election cycle, like really early on, a poll could actually influence who even jumps into the race. So if Joe Schmo has a really strong showing in a poll and he jumps in really early into the race and says, look at me, I've got 75% of the primary voters that are going to vote in primaries, they are going to support me. People might as well not even join or jump into the race. That could very seriously dissuade people from entering the race. I'll use actually an example from my state, Florida. So the consensus frontrunner right now is Byron Donalds, who is currently a Republican member of the U.S. House. He is running to succeed Ron DeSantis here in the state of Florida. He has the backing of Donald Trump. He has polled pretty well for the most part, and that has possibly dissuaded some candidates from ultimately jumping into the race, namely Casey DeSantis, who is Ron DeSantis' wife, and Jay Collins, who is the current lieutenant governor of Florida. I'm not saying that that's definitely why they haven't said they're jumping into the race. They haven't said that they're not, but it could be part of the calculus. Now, there are other candidates who have jumped into the Republican primary for governor, like Paul Renner, who used to be the Speaker of the State House, and James Fishback, who has some controversies going on right now. He is another candidate that is running for the Republican primary for governor in Florida. But all that to say, Byron Donalds' strong showing and polling may have at least convinced a few Republicans who might have otherwise jumped in readily to at least hem and haw about whether they're going to jump in. So that's another way that the timing of polls very much matters. And ideally, you want multiple polls across time to showcase a trend, because that's more information than just having one election. So if you're seeing one candidate's numbers trend up ever so slightly, that'll look very good for that candidate, as opposed to if you just had one poll for them and you couldn't really tell how much that was fluctuating before and after. So all sorts of ways that the timing of polls can matter as well. But you should always take them with a little bit of a grain of salt if they're really early on, in terms of who is going to win a race. Because once again, we get too caught up in the, who's winning this race? Polls are not meant to be predictions. They're meant to be snapshots in time of what public opinion is as best as we can estimate public opinion. Now, one last thing before we get to the end here is a term you may have heard that is very nebulous, and it's called a likely voter. What is a likely voter? Lots of polls use the likely voter metric to gauge who is going to actually turn out to vote in an election. Because if they're not going to turn out to vote in an election, you can't really rely on their opinions to affect who actually wins the election. If you don't vote, you can't have any influence on the election. So some pollsters will use registered voters instead, or voting age population. But generally, if you're trying to really figure out who's going to win an election, you're probably going to use likely voters. Now, likely voter is probably going to be self-explanatory, but it's just someone who is expected to vote. And the way you calculate that is you base it on past voting history primarily, because that makes whether you vote this time or not fairly predictable, because the best indication of whether somebody is going to vote is if they voted previously. Now, obviously, there's new voters who have only just gotten old enough to vote that you can't necessarily gauge like that. But people who are older voters who have at least had several elections that they could have voted in, if they voted before, it's very likely they're going to vote again unless there's some sort of unforeseen circumstance. And presidential elections will have the highest turnout rate of the major types of elections. That is midterm elections, odd year elections, special elections. Presidential elections is going to be the highest, and then midterm elections are going to be the second highest. There will be some fluctuation in the percentages, like you might have, depending on your metric, you might have 65, 70% for presidential elections, but then you might have only like 50, 55, 60% for midterm elections. Just as a general rule of thumb to compare the two. You won't necessarily see those specific numbers, but there'll be a little bit of fluctuations between presidential elections. There'll be a little bit of fluctuation between midterm elections, but generally speaking, or not generally speaking, you'll always see higher turnout in presidential elections versus midterm elections. And so if somebody votes in midterm elections all the time, they're almost guaranteed to vote in the midterm election this coming time, because 2026 is a midterm election. If they vote in presidential elections, but they don't vote in midterm elections, it's going to be hard to rely on them to turn out for this coming midterm election. So those are a couple of ways that you can gauge likely voters. But maybe you want a more specific formula. What is the specific formula for telling who a likely voter is? There's not an exact formula. I am sorry to say. There's a little bit of nuance to it, just like there is for most things in politics. Every pollster, though, has their own super secret calculation for it that they don't release. It's under wraps. It's proprietary. But the best indication of whether you will vote is your past history of voting. But what if that voting history is murky and inconsistent? Well, again, that depends on the pollster's internal formula, but they may consider likelihood of voting based on other opinions they gave in the poll. So if there was a question that explicitly asked, how likely are you to vote? They might use that to say, oh, okay, this person's a likely voter. Now, again, that's pretty tricky to use because somebody can say that they're very enthusiastic about voting now, but then ultimately they don't actually turn out to vote in the end, especially if this is months from now that this election is happening. So anybody can tell you, oh yeah, I'm enthusiastic about voting, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to vote. They might be enthusiastic right now, or they might think, oh, I should say I'm enthusiastic about voting. Or what if you tweak the question there? Because tweaking the wording of questions can make all the difference in the opinion. If you ask how enthusiastic somebody is to vote versus how likely they are to vote, or are you looking forward to voting? They might not sound like that different of a question to you, but it really can make all the difference in how people respond. Other examples of public opinion or other answers they give in these public opinion surveys that people could use to measure likelihood or a likely voter is they might indicate a strong opinion on a political issue that pollster expects to be a critical flashpoint in an election. So if they expect abortion to be a key issue for the election, and a voter who is otherwise not that consistent of a voter, but they signaled a strong, I am a very firm supporter of abortion, I'm a firm opponent of abortion, they might say, okay, that person's actually probably going to turn out to vote this time because that's expected to be a very key issue. And they also might use demographic info that they think will play a role for various reasons. So if there's younger candidates in an election that are 35, 40 years old, then the pollster might expect more younger voters to turn out to vote, even if they don't normally turn out to vote, or they've just become a voter for the first time. Again, there's not an exact formula, and these organizations are not going to tell you their exact formula. They're just going to say, oh, these are how many likely voters we polled, but you can't get the exact way that they got to likely voters. And then to wrap things up with the likely voters, when should we consider unlikely voters' opinions? And that's a very tricky question to answer because it depends on what a pollster's intention is, not just because of the past voting history of these unlikely voters, but when do you even want to know these unlikely voters' opinions? If a pollster simply wants to know the general public opinion, or they want to win an election, but they think they can get irregular voters to support their candidate, then they might start looking at registered voters in general or voting age population to say, okay, I think these people who are not registered to vote or people who are registered to vote, but they don't vote very often, I think we can get these people. And every once in a while, you do have a candidate who will do that. Donald Trump was adept at getting a lot of first-time voters. So was Barack Obama when he ran for office. Two key examples there. Now, those are exceptions to the rule. If people don't vote, they're likely to continue to not vote. But you every once in a while will get a candidate who sparks something in these people and they go, you know what? I'm actually going to turn out to the polls. But again, that depends on what the pollster's aiming for, what they think is important, what their formula is. So there's really no clear-cut answer there. So to wrap things up, key message here is always have a little bit of skepticism about polls, but not too much, because like most things in politics, it's always good to have skepticism, just a little skepticism about polls. Problem is, people become too distrusting of polls because they don't understand them. And a lot of times when we don't understand something, we don't trust it. Or politicians that we support were mad about a poll that made them look bad. And so we say, oh yeah, that poll sucks. Oh, all polls suck unless they conveniently support or make the candidate I support look good. But that's not the way we should be looking at them. And I know polls are not fun to read into for most people. I mean, I don't even always like reading them. I mean, as much as I thoroughly enjoy learning about and discussing about politics and bringing that information to people, I don't necessarily like getting into the very nitty gritty of polls either. But you should try finding somebody who tries to go a little deeper into polls and tries to be balanced in their analysis and tries to break it down as easily as they possibly can, because it is something worthwhile for you to at least learn a little bit about, so that you don't just get caught up in whatever media tells you about these polls. Some polls are not that important, and some polls get overblown, and then some polls get criticized way too much. Just remember, polls have an inherent uncertainty about them because you can't get the entire population's opinion. You have to sample them. But it does not mean they are inherently unreliable. You just have to know what you are doing with them, how to use them, how to interpret them, so you don't get taken for a ride by media who have either an axe to grind with polls, or they just talk about polls as if all of them are interesting or matter, just so you can equip yourself better to have better discussions in political discourse. But that's going to wrap things up for today's episode of the Politics with Paul podcast. Thank you all so much. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And in the future, if this expands out to other platforms, please like, share, comment, subscribe, rate, review. My links in the show notes, my 5-day educational email course about how we can all do better in depolarizing politics in America, because sometimes we unintentionally inflame that polarization. This EEC educational email course talks about ways that you can be better about doing that, how to correct those mistakes. My LinkedIn profile that I write on very frequently, my Facebook.com profile, Paul Rader, author and speaker, Medium.com profile, email paulraderwrites@gmail.com, my website paulrader.org, and my book on Amazon about political independence and why they struggle so much in elections and how that could possibly change in the future. And that is going to end things here. So thank you all so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.